Welcome to the Bad Roman Podcast. On this show, we talk with veterans, community leaders, Christians and non-Christians as we explore the entanglement of Christians with the state. The Bad Roman Project was created out of the firm belief that as Christians, we are called to follow Christ, not the state. Here is your host, Craig Hargis.
Hey folks, let's talk Romans 13. How about 1 Peter 2? How about Revelation 13 within a Deuteronomy 32 worldview? Today, Matt Mouzakis from Expedition 44 comes back on the show to discuss his dissertation that, in my opinion, is the most detailed understanding about how the Christian should read these scriptures, which unfortunately has caused so much confusion among Christians and how we engage the empire. The last time Matt was on the show, we touched on Romans 13 a bit, but starting today, we are going to reach out and touch Romans 13 as understood among the early church.
Let's go. Yeah. Left, right, left, right, left. We got our marching orders, man. Left, right. We'd rather serve God than serve Caesar, you feel me? Right. I'm just trying to live what he said.
Matt Mouzakis, how are you doing, my friend?
Hey, it's good to be back on the Bad Roman, Craig. It's good to talk with you, and yeah, just thankful to be here and thankful for your project.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate y'all's project too. The Expedition 44, y'all just recently finished up at the time of this recording, we finished up a series on original sin, and I've loved that series so much because it's the way you break this stuff down. And the stuff that you're breaking down how Calvin and Luther and then how the early church responded, understood original sin, man, that's another topic that seems to confuse a lot of Christians these days, and it seems to separate a lot of Christians today as well. And we're not going to talk about original sin today, obviously, but I just want to let you know how much I appreciated that series because the way you guys break it down, it's good stuff. Folks, if you have not checked out Original Sin on Expedition 44, go check it out because it's fascinating.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that was a fun series to do, and we just wrapped it up yesterday at the time of the recording here. Yeah.
So, and when I said in the intro, how as understood among the early church. Now, the early church at this time, they did not have a Romans 13 like we're going to discuss today, or a 1 Peter 2. So, I'm pretty sure anybody listening to the show is going to understand that, but I wanted to add that at the, because I added that at the end of the intro. But I've read this dissertation, and we've seen people discuss Romans 13 over and over and over again. It seems like you got different views on it, but to me, the way you broke this down, because you broke it down into two parts, 6 chapters, I think.
Yeah.
And you build the case around how a Christian should engage Romans 13. You build it around a Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And this is something that I was unfamiliar with. It's not that I've never read it. It's just that I've never connected the two for some reason. And you were able to do that. And I appreciate that. And that's what we're going to start with today is Deuteronomy 32. So folks, what Matt has agreed to do, we don't know how long this is going to take. And this is the first for the Bad Roman podcast is we're going to actually do a series of episodes on this topic, because instead of trying to cram everything into one episode, which would take a Joe Rogan type episode, probably 3 or 4 hours, we're not going to do that to you. We're going to break it up in hour and 15-minute episodes. And we're going to start with Deuteronomy 32. And it's going to build a case into Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, and Revelation 13. A lot of these texts that are used to defend one's belief in the empire and how we should engage the empire. Mm-hmm. Well, Matt Mouzakis puts all that to rest. This Romans 13 nonsense is fixing to be put to rest, on the next few episodes. We don't know if it's going to take 3 episodes, 4 episodes, maybe 5 episodes. We're going to see. We're going to kind of play it out. It's going to take at least 3, most likely 4, but we'll see how it goes, and possibly a 5th bonus episode to conclude everything.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. I mean, it's obviously a topic near and dear to my heart. It took 3 years to write about it. So,
well, you got over 300 pages on this in this dissertation. That's what I'm saying. This is the most detailed thing I've ever read on this topic. And today we're going to start with Deuteronomy 32. And you're the expert on this. Like I said, this is kind of new. This is new ground for me, and I'm excited to hear you talk about this, because I've read it, but I want to hear you talk about it. So you want to dive into it? Let's dive into it.
Yeah. So today, let's just tackle some of the Old Testament stuff, and then we can kind of get more into those New Testament texts, because I think so much of our biblical interpretation, I think we need to the New Testament writers keep going back to the texts of the Old Testament. So if we understand what they meant, we can understand, that whole background behind what these New Testament texts are saying. And sometimes the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is called the Divine Council worldview. So I guess we can probably start with digging into like what that is. So really, if you go back, we should read Scripture, I believe, through the eyes and the ears and however you want to say that, of the original audience, how they would have originally understood it, and not just how we understand it. John Walton has this saying which says the Bible wasn't written to us, but it was written for us. So we need to understand who the Bible was written to and what it would have meant for them so we can interpret what it means for us. And so I think this is so important with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So really, Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9 talk about, it's Moses recounting the Tower of Babel and what happened at the Tower of Babel. And what we see in the Genesis account in Genesis 10 and 11 is the people were divided up by language, but Moses has like a different view of what that meant. And we see that in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, where when God divided up the nations, that he put what it says there in basically an Elohim, a God, over the nations. So he disinherits all these people who refuse God, basically refuse to have Yahweh as their God. And basically he assigns members of his council to each of these nations. And instead of these gods pointing them back to Yahweh, who is the God of gods, creator of everything, they take the glory and the honor and the worship for themselves. It leads to corruption. Maybe we can talk a little bit later about Psalm 82. That kind of gets into this, where God is judging the other gods because of what they've done. This is why the devil in the temptation of Jesus is able to offer Jesus all the nations, because they're his, right? But Yahweh, it says in that text, takes Israel as his own. And the purpose of the covenant with Abraham was to regain all the nations. God's plan was to set things right in that, but we see throughout all of the Old Testament that they have this view of that there's these spiritual beings that are assigned to all these other nations that aren't God's people, which are hostile towards God.
When it says set up gods among these other nations, these are not gods equal to Yahweh, or who are these gods? Because I think there's a lot of confusion with this, because are they demons? Are they Satan? Are they all Satan? Because I guess I know a lot of people I've heard use, when we talk about Satan, they'll use Satan as like he could be any, it's just an adversary. It could be any, it's not just one person. It's not, it's so, and that's the way they understood Satan to be. It could be it's just an adversary towards God. And that's who these other gods are that were set up above these other nations.
Yeah. So what we see in the beginning, when God is creating the world, we see from Job that his heavenly hosts, the angels, you might call it, well, angels are just a subcategory of spiritual beings. They're messengers. So you see the heavenly hosts are cheering for God as he's creating in Job. I believe it's Job chapter 32. It talks about that. We see even in like the Garden of Eden, even the way that the serpent, the Nahash in Hebrew, is described is in terms of spiritual beings. When you look at it kind of through the lens of the Hebrew. And so God has like this heavenly staff team, let's say. It's called the Divine Council, both in Psalm 82 and Psalm 89. And so he has this team that's working with him, just as humans made in the image of God. We're supposed to partner with God in creation, to work and keep the garden, to partner with God in ruling the world. Not ruling over each other, but ruling the world together. So we see in the heavens, God has kind of the same thing going on with the spiritual beings. And so some people might think like the word Elohim is like a name for God. You might have heard that word before, Elohim.
Right.
It's really a category when you look at it, because it's like saying mammal. A mammal could be a monkey, a bear, a human, but we're all like different, right? All of those are different. So a spiritual being is like you have Yahweh, who is, the Bible says, the creator of everything. He's the creator of the gods. It even says in Psalm 89. So everything was created through him. And so he has made these other spiritual beings, just as he has made everything in like the earthly realm. And so when we're looking at at this, God has a team with him up there. Some evidence of this is in 1 Kings 22. King Ahab is kind of running amok, and God says, all right, his time is up. And so he goes to his council and he says, hey, how are we going to basically stop this evil king? And it says that one spiritual being came forward and gave an idea, and another came forward and gave another idea, and one came forward and said, hey, I'll be basically a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets, and tell him to go out into battle and he'll die in battle. And God says, okay, that's a good idea. Why don't you go do that? And so you see that even like in their worldview, they had this like, yes, God's the one who makes the decisions, but God is always a God who wants participation in relationship. So even in the world, like the terrestrial realm, like the physical realm that we're in, it's that way. God wanted to partner with humanity. Like in creation, God wants to partner with the spiritual beings in creation, and but we see that throughout the story of the Old Testament that they rebel against Him. So, I mean, some remain loyal and some rebel, just as humans. Some remain loyal and some rebel.
That's so cool because it really flies in the face of this idea that people have about this authoritarian type God, where he's just kind of putting pressure down on everybody, just ruling over and not like. But I like how you put it. He wanted to partner with humanity. He wanted to partner with folks. And
like God is relational. I mean,
sounds like voluntarism to me. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I think Trinitarianism is that. I mean, in the Godhead, we have three co-equal parts, and they're partnering with each other. They display different aspects in that. But I mean, even when you look at like Genesis 1, when God says, "Let us make mankind in our own image," some people think that's the Trinity talking to each other. I think he's talking to his council because, I mean, they were his partners in the heavens already at that point. He says, hey, let's let us make mankind in the same way so we can have partners in relationship to work together in the physical realm. And then also in Genesis 11, it talks about let us come down and see what mankind's doing when they're building the Tower of Babel. I think that he's talking also to his council there. Now, I'm Trinitarian, and I could see how some people take that, but I think the divine council, spiritual being point of view to those verses make more sense in the minds of the ancient readers.
Okay, I'm Trinitarian as well too, so I that's interesting. I'd always just viewed that as God talking to Jesus and the Holy Spirit. So I mean, that does make a little more sense that he has talking to his council. But would Jesus and the Holy Spirit not be part of his council, or are we just talking about other?
Well, I think they're part of the Godhead, so I think that they're the head of the council. But you have these other spiritual beings like the Satan.
Yeah. Okay.
Could be part of that council. You have seraphim and cherubim, and like as it said in 1 Kings 22, these spiritual beings that are coming forward. In Revelation 4 and 5, you have basically the elders laying down their crowns. That could be part of that council as well before the throne.
And the cherubim is not the little naked babies running, flying around with the wings.
No.
Just
no. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, even in the spiritual realm, you got seraphim, which are kind of like throne guardians. You got cherubim, which are kind of like worship leaders. You got angels who are messengers. You got all sorts of different jobs. You got the Satan, who's a spiritual being, who's basically kind of the prosecuting attorney.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Jesus. Okay.
On the court.
Jesus is the defense attorney. I've heard that put before as well. Like in church, like Jesus is our advocate. He's our like say you're going to court and Jesus is the defense attorney for you in front of God. So anyway, not to get too far off track, but I've heard that described that way in church before.
Yeah. So those are kind of some of the ways that we can look at like the spiritual worldview. And then when we get back to Deuteronomy 32, so you have like these council members that are put over these nations. And I believe initially that what God did there was for these gods to, I don't think they had fallen yet. I think that there's some evidence in scripture that they were really supposed to point the nations back to God. And Psalm 82 kind of points that. He's like, well, why didn't you do justice? Why have you forsaken like the lowly and that? And they were supposed to like be like partnering with God to help rule these nations and point them back to the way that God wanted them to be. But especially through like the texts of Second Temple Judaism, we see how they interpret a lot of that and how these gods were then led the people astray. And that kind of gets to some other Jewish views. So
no, I want you to keep going there, but I have a question. So you said they had not fallen yet, but he'd put the council over these nations, kind of direct them back to God. And so when people say that God set up nations, well, no, it was human beings that set up these governments, but God was putting the council over them to direct them back to God.
Yep.
And then they fell. And now we have this mess that we live in today, basically, for years and years and years, obviously. But
yeah, and even in the Abrahamic covenant, the purpose of that covenant was so that Abraham would become a great nation to be a blessing to the nations, basically to draw them back in and draw them back to where they had fallen from, because the people were going astray, and God puts these angels, whatever you want to call them, spiritual beings over them to direct them back. And eventually they let the power and the worship and all of that get to them, and they lead them further astray.
This is fascinating stuff, man, because this is stuff that you don't hear in church. I've never heard this stuff in church, but a lot of the churches I attended just were pretty much statist anyway and just did whatever the government told them to do. So regardless, they had the American flags and all that stuff on their stages. So I feel like I'm a kindergartner right now being taught some brand new stuff, because I don't know. This stuff's fascinating to me, and it's just really, we might have to do 10 episodes. I don't know.
Do that. But like, this isn't like a new thing. I'm like, if you read the early church, they believed in this Deuteronomy 32 worldview. If you read Second Temple Judaism, they believed in this Deuteronomy 32 worldview. It's just that we've lost it because, like, and I don't know, like, over the course of history, I don't know why. One of my favorites who writes on this is Dr. Michael Heiser. He passed away about a year ago. He has this book called The Unseen Realm, which kind of I piggybacked off of a lot of the work that he did. So this isn't original to me. And all of his work in this is peer-reviewed, scholarly supported, working off of other works that have been finding this stuff. So it's not just something that people have pulled out of thin air. He has it like well documented in his work, plus a whole bunch of other scholars take this also. John Walton's another one who's phenomenal with that. So yeah, this isn't just some like thing that, Matt made up and that, but it's really actually documented in the early church. It's documented in Second Temple Judaism. You can see the worldview if you read texts outside of the Bible. It's kind of what they thought in that age. And the Bible's actually critiquing some of the ways that the pagans viewed this. And so maybe we can get into some of that later. But so one thing I was thinking of, when we look at the Bible, and you and I were talking about this before the show, is how kind of in the West we see, like, when we look at the Bible, and if we ask the question, why is the world the way it is, we would just say, Adam's sin in the garden, right? Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. Yeah. But if you ask a Jew that, an ancient Jew that would not have been their primary answer. They would see that as part of the answer, but that's like our only answer. They see at least 3 falls in Genesis 1 through 11. And so I think we should kind of get into that, because it really sets up like this worldview that we began to talk about. And it's really important as the backdrop behind all these government texts that we get into in the New Testament then.
The floor is yours, man. Treat this as your podcast like you do Expedition 44, because go ahead and explain this to us, because you got it going on. So yeah, the floor is yours. And like I said, if I jump in, it's just because my mind is going crazy and I got a question to ask. So
yeah, no, if you have a question, interrupt me. I'm good with it. This is your show. So.
Hey folks, do you like salsa? I love salsa. I have come up with a fire recipe, and we have been shipping this homemade salsa all across the country. If you like salsa and want a cool way to support the project and spread the message of no king but Christ, then holler at us. You can reach us at badromansalsa@gmail.com or visit the official Bad Roman Salsa Facebook page and message us there. Thank y'all so much for your continued support. Now let's get back to the show.
So we kind of all know the story of creation and Genesis 3 with the serpent in the garden. In Hebrew, it's Nahash, which Nahash is kind of interesting because it's what we kind of at its root. It means that it's someone who's shrewd or wise. It means that they're shiny, and it means seraph, which was a throne room guardian, spiritual being. And so we kind of see what in Genesis, when you kind of look kind of at the text, in Hebrew and cross-referenced it elsewhere, Eden was like kind of like the Holy of Holies. It was this mountaintop garden, and ancient people depicted like the throne room of the gods was on top of the mountains. We see these rivers flowing out of it. So it kind of shows, even in Genesis, that it was on top of a mountain. And ancient people believed that the divine councils met on top of the mountains. So Adam and Eve were kind of partnering with God in his divine council work. They were his original priests in the garden. And it seems like this serpent tricked them or got jealous or something, and they fell. They wanted to determine what was good and evil, what was right and wrong by their own perception rather than living by the way God called them to live. So that's kind of the first fall. So we do see that introduced death into the world. So that's one of the major things in the Bible that Jesus is reversing is death. So that's the first fall. That brings separation from the tree of life and death into the world. The second fall that we get is in Genesis 6. It's kind of a very weird story, and a lot of people don't know what to do with it. And there's a lot of different opinions on it of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and they make babies, and they're these giants called the Nephilim, right? And a lot of people are like, all right, that's just weird. We don't know what to do with that. And so they try to explain it away in a naturalistic form. It's called the Sethite view, or, oh, well, this is just about the sons of Seth. But the text really, I think it's not a great view. And then there's some other views out there. But I think the most logical one is that, and we've found this through like basically in the last 50 years and all the archaeology and new texts and stuff that are coming out, it seems like it's really a critique of Babylon. This whole thing, it's a story like correcting their point of view. So there's these divine beings in Babylonian literature called the Apkallu, and so they had this forbidden knowledge, and so they would come down to the kings of Babylon, and they would basically give them this knowledge of how to build their empire and how to rule the world, essentially, by the way of the gods. And so they do this, and eventually these kings become basically like half Apkallu and half human. It kind of mimics that story that Genesis 6 is critiquing, but it's saying that the reason that the flood came was to get rid of these giants, is kind of the way that it depicts it in Genesis chapter 6 all the way through Genesis chapter 9. And so in the Babylonian literature, they're praising this forbidden knowledge and how it makes their empire so great. But the Bible's critiquing that, saying that, no, this is actually demonic. This empire building is actually demonic. And so that's kind of the picture behind Genesis 6 and the second fall is all of this, that Babylonian stuff in the background saying that, no, this is actually like not the way God intended the world to be.
Well, and yeah, I love that you said this. Basically, the Bible's calling it demonic, which is something we talk about quite a bit on the Bad Roman podcast. When we talk about government, when we talk about the temptation of Christ, when we see who's backing the governments of this world. And when we get in these discussions with folks, when it comes to no king but Christ, we're always hit with Romans 13. And they tell you the first 7 verses of Romans 13 and walk away like they want to debate. And I'm like, hang on a second. There's so much more here. You know, we always fall back on, well, why did you read Romans 12? But what about 1 Peter 2? But what about Deuteronomy 32 and the worldview, the divine counsel? Do you know anything about this? There's so much more here that you're missing. You can't drop 7 verses with Craig and be like, I won this debate, I'm walking away and never talk to me again.
Yeah.
Well, hang on a second. I got some questions. What about the temptation of Christ? We always talk about how it's demonic. The governments of this world, even the United States government, is demonic. And I'd never shy away from calling this out, seeing it like I see it, because it's so important to me for Christians to understand that if you're out there supporting a government, participating in government, you're supporting something that is demonic. And as a Christian, you should be the first one to flee from this stuff. And that's where my source of frustration is with Christians when it comes to this topic, this conversation is you have all the information right there in the Bible about how demonic the government is, but somehow you think you can fix it.
Yeah, and so there's a scholar, Amar Anis, and he was kind of the guy who found a lot of these texts and kind of traced so much of their background and how it influences some of the early chapters in Genesis. And yes, I believe Genesis is telling a lot of historical stuff, but I think at the same time, a lot of Genesis 1 through 11 was completed during the exile time of Israel, even though all of this speaks to much earlier times, but they're writing it in such a way that I believe is a critique of empire. Like Genesis 1 through 11, I think is very much a critique of why is the world the way it is, you know? So you can see that they're taking the supernatural worldview and doing that. And a lot of scholars actually do fall this way. Some of that, it's like it paints God's ideals on the first and last pages of the Bible. And then everything in the middle is just kind of messed up and how Jesus has now put us on an upward trajectory. So
I remember you saying that too the first time I had you on the show, and you said that, you got the beginning and the end and everything in the middle is just kind of messed up. When you said that to me on the first time I had you on the show, I was like, that's it. That's a perfect way to describe the Bible.
Yeah.
And we're just trying to get back to Jesus at this point.
Yeah, we're getting back to Eden. So
the way God intended it from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, all right, y'all done this. I'm going to get you back here at some point. It's going to take a little bit of time, though, because y'all really screwed this up.
Yeah, and so you got in Genesis 3, you kind of have sin. And some of the other things that we get in the Second Temple period about Genesis 6, the way that they explain it. So there's a lot of writing, especially like Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, and even like tons of other stuff. Like they talked about the divine council worldview, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, like constantly in the Second Temple period, which the Second Temple period is the period between when they rebuilt the temple after exile until Rome destroyed it again in 70 AD. So that's the Second Temple period. And they wrote a ton there. And so in a lot of these writings, the way that they commented on Genesis 6 in this whole thing is they saw that, before the Nephilim even came, that there's these spiritual beings that come down and they teach humankind forbidden knowledge, very similar to this Babylon stuff that we just talked about. So their take on it was that they taught humans how to make weapons, how to make war, women how to be seductive, all of this stuff. They say that these spiritual beings taught humanity forbidden knowledge, that they corrupted humanity. And so they see this as like the second phase of the fall was not only that death was brought into the world from Genesis 3, sin brought into the world through Genesis 6, and kind of the whole corrupting of humanity by teaching them these things that humans weren't even supposed to know or do. And then you get to Babel, where basically now they start worshiping other gods after they've been disinherited, and they start making empires.
These other gods that they're worshiping, are these the ones that this is what was set up, and then they've got...
Yeah, in Deuteronomy 32, yeah.
Are these the gods they're worshiping? This is the council that fell, the fallen angels that they're called so often, is this who the gods they're worshiping, or do they know that they're worshiping fallen angels? Or maybe I'm confusing this, and I apologize, but I'm trying to piece this together where what we talked about earlier, how he set up over the nations to bring them back to God, and then they fell. Was it like they got a taste of power? They got a taste of power, like, maybe we can build our own empire.
That's the way I see it.
And so these folks at the tower started worshiping these gods instead of Yahweh.
Yeah, that's kind of the Jewish worldview of what they see happened there. So basically, these gods of the divine council at Deuteronomy 32 were placed over the nations, Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. We're supposed to shepherd them back to the right way. But instead, they introduced divine knowledge and empire building and war and take the worship for themselves, get a taste of power, and it corrupted them.
Is this the first or the second or the third fall? You said they saw 3 falls.
Kind of a mix of all of them. So first one is basically the Garden of Eden, which introduces death into the world.
Okay. Right.
And separation from God. Then you got Genesis 6, which is kind of the introduction of forbidden knowledge, they call it. So sin, like it increases sin. And then you got Genesis 11, which is the Tower of Babel, and Deuteronomy 32 kind of overlapped there. And you have then God disinheriting these people, dividing up the languages, because they were trying to make a name for themselves and putting these spiritual beings over them. And it just, everything keeps spiraling out of control. If you notice, right after the Tower of Babel, what's the first thing God does when all this stuff happens? He calls Abraham and wants to create his own nation to fix everything, right? To bring people back into his kingdom. So that is Genesis 12. I mean, that's his response to all of this is, all right, the kingdom of God is going to eventually pull everybody in and be a blessing to the world.
It's funny. You were talking last night at work. So we have a lot of immigrants from all over the world that come and work where we work, right? We're sitting in the break room. I think this was right after I got off the phone with you, actually. And they're all talking in their native tongues, right? And somebody goes, man, there's so many different languages going on in here. I was like, it's like the Tower of Babel, isn't it? And he looked at me all confused, and I went back to reading your dissertation while I was on break.
That's hilarious. Yeah. We could talk a little bit about Psalm 82 because it kind of goes into this. So that's kind of like a background of the way ancient Jews saw the world. Was they saw that, yeah, they were supposed to be God's instruments to reclaim everything, but they failed at it.
Well, let me ask you something real quick. I don't know if this is jumping too far ahead because I've got your dissertation pulled up, and in chapter 2, it's 1-2, the Satan in the Old Testament. Is this, you said, when considering spiritual beings, the character Satan enters the discussion as the enemy of God and central enemy of the Bible's narrative. But a question we need to ask is, what is the evidence we can find for Satan in the Old Testament? My confusion, and maybe a lot of other Christians' confusion, when we talk about Satan, we all think of this one central figure being the guy ruling hell and his demons. He's got his army of demons. And this is the way it's understood by a lot of the Western Christian churches, I think. Or maybe it's just a simplified version that they're teaching. And I think there's so much more than just this one guy. It's just an adversary of God. It's against God. So it's not just one guy, Satan. It's just anything that's against the plan of God.
Yeah, I think that it can be a bit of both. So when we say Satan, I mean that word shows up in Job chapters 1 and 2, obviously, and we see even in Job chapter 1 and 2 a divine council scene. God calls basically his council into session, and the Satan is there. If you read it in Hebrew, it's ha-satan, or which the ha in front of it means the. And so it's not a proper name. We always make Satan like a proper name, like Craig or Matt, but it's the Satan or the accuser or the adversary. We don't call ourselves the Matt or the Craig, right?
I'm probably going to start calling myself the Craig because I think that just gives me more authority.
Yeah.
I am the Craig.
You're the Craig. Yeah. So yeah, this is the accuser. So it seems to be, maybe it's a position on the council. Some take that way. We get about 19 appearances of Satan, with that the word in front of it in the Old Testament. You got Zechariah chapter 3. It's listed twice there. Job is listed a whole bunch of times. And so, but you also have it occur like 10 other times in the Old Testament without it. So in Numbers, in 1 Samuel, in 2 Samuel, in 1 Kings 15, a whole bunch of other times that it shows up, which is interesting because if you want to make it a person or an individual name, the angel of the Lord is called a Satan when basically he comes against the guy with the talking donkey. You've got a whole bunch of different instances. So if you're gonna take that is the word Satan is just, it's just somebody who comes against somebody is really kind of what it means. And even diablos, which is the devil in Greek, means the same thing: an accuser, an adversary, someone who comes against that.
Well, so when God brought the council together, you said that Satan was present there too.
Yeah, in Job 1 and 2, chapters 1 and 2, you have it that way.
So what's he doing there? I mean, if he's the adversary, what's he doing there? If he's still part of the council?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. So all that the Satan does in Job is ask God a question about his policy of blessing the righteous and punishing the wicked. He said, if you basically, Job's only being righteous to get stuff is basically what his question is. So he's questioning God's policy on that. And is it a good question or is it an evil question? You can't tell, right? So you can't just jump to the conclusion that the Satan there in the book of Job is evil. All he's doing is asking God a question about his policy. And so that's kind of the way I take it. Now, in the Second Temple period, we definitely see, like, after this Deuteronomy 32 worldview in the fall, that they see that, all right, so there's all of these fallen spiritual beings that are ruling these nations. And they kind of are thinking, well, they probably have a leader. And so that's when we get, like, the devil in the New Testament who tempts Jesus. And even in the Old Testament, or sorry, not the Old Testament, the Second Temple Judaism, you get all sorts of different names for kind of this primary bad guy figure, like Belial, you have Azazel, you've got Mastema, you even have Satan. You have, I think it's in the book of Jubilees, there's 3 or 4 Satans.
The reason I brought that up is because you wrote extensively about Satan in this Deuteronomy 32 worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I brought it up, because, like I said, there seems to be a lot of confusion with Satan, especially in the New Testament, when the temptation of Christ. But it's not just one person. It's just anything that's in conflict with the plan of God or God's policy, as you said it.
I'm not against there being a singular Satan who might be the primary bad guy. I mean, you can't get that from the Old Testament is what I'm saying.
Okay.
You can definitely get there in the New Testament.
Right.
I think, at least.
And I think that's probably where a lot of the confusion is because it does read different in the Old Testament than it does in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, it seems like when they're talking about Satan, they're talking about one guy.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the times, but not so much in the Old Testament.
Yeah, in the Old Testament, in Job, I think we make Satan evil when he's actually, it reads more neutral, I think. Or maybe he's got a job and his job is to, like, help God with policies. So,
yeah,
he
just got that name tied to him that makes him the devil with the horns and the tail.
Yeah, so it's like the adversary, the one who comes against.
Right.
And so, it very well could be the same guy, or it could be something that came about from further revelation.
All right, so we pinned down who that guy is.
Yeah.
Now, what do you say? Hey, folks. We have set up a very simple way to donate to the Bad Roman Project through spotfund.com. Just go to SpotFund and search No King But Christ. This has become necessary to continue to provide a quality podcast and keep production costs down as well. Just $5 or $10 a month will go a long way in helping us keep this project going and continue spreading the very basic message of No King But Christ. So if you like what we were doing and can find it within your budget, go to spotfund.com and search No King But Christ, and you can set up monthly donations or even donate one time. Any and all donations help more than you know, and as always, any donations above production costs will go directly to charities in Memphis, Tennessee. Thank y'all so much. Now back to the show. Like I said, you wrote quite a bit about Satan in this first part of this dissertation. So if you want to go into like the Psalms part that you were just talking about too and tie that in.
Yeah, Psalm 82. I'll just read it. It's a very short psalm, only 8 verses. So God takes his stand in the divine council. He judges in the midst of the gods. How long will you judge and rule unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and the fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and needy, deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say to you, you are gods, you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like men, like any one of their princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you possess all the nations. Or you will possess all the nations. So, kind of in that, we see right at the beginning, God has a meeting with his divine council in this psalm. He's pronouncing judgment on the other gods. And so what you have here is you have a singular Elohim, which is God, Yahweh, judging other plural Elohim. So we see it's a council of gods there. He's saying that, all right, they're not doing justice. They're letting the wicked and the evil get away with all their crap, basically. And he's saying, hey, why didn't you do what I told you to do? Essentially, was to do justice. So that makes me think that they're originally supposed to do good, right? That they weren't evil when God handed the nations over, that they were supposed to do something. And then at the end, he's like, you're going to be judged. He's like, you're going to die like men. He's like, you're gods, but you're going to die like men. It's funny that Jesus, when he's talking to the religious leaders in John 10, quotes from this verse here. And Jesus, what he's doing in that isn't saying that the Pharisees or these other people are gods or something, but he's saying that he's putting himself in the way of Yahweh, in the place of Yahweh, like in the same part in this picture, in this analogy. And he's pronouncing judgment on the Pharisees for leading the people astray in John chapter 10. So he's using kind of the same analogy,
Okay,
which I think is really interesting. So
that's very interesting. It's one of those. It's not anything that I've ever noticed. Like I said, that's why I'm glad that you've agreed to do this and turn it into a series, because you've got so much knowledge on this topic that, and especially this time of year going into like an election year. You know, we're gonna talk about no, keep it Christ. Don't spend your time at the voting booth, and then Romans 13 is going to come up. It's like, hang on, we got like a 4 or 5 episode series that you need to listen to when it comes to how you engage the empire.
If you go over to Psalm 89, also it talks about the Lord, his faithfulness in the assemblies of the holy ones. So the divine council of the holy ones. Who is like you in the skies? Who can compare to you? Who among the sons of God is like the Lord? So it's pointing here, because some people have an issue with, all right, like that there are these other gods and God's partnering with other spiritual beings. But Psalm 89 is like the definitive text saying that, all right, God has created these. He's higher than them. He's greater than them. That who is like you among all the other spiritual beings? So it's a text that really just displays how God is so much higher above all of these other gods. God is a relational God. He wants to partner, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, like I said, it flies in the face of this idea that, because it's something that we're, especially when I talk to somebody, if I talk to another anarchist who's not a Christian, they're maybe even an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they don't believe is because they have this view of God just bearing down on people all the time and ruling over you, telling you how you live your life. And I've tried to explain it to them, and you're explaining it now. I don't view Jesus as somebody who's ruling over me. I've always viewed Jesus as somebody who's wanting to partner with me. He wants me to live the best life I can live while I'm here. You know, it's not like I like to view Jesus, and maybe I'm getting off topic and I apologize, but I like to view him as somebody he's got some really good ideas, but a lot of times I don't follow his ideas, and it makes my life harder. But it's not God making my life harder. It's just Craig doing something stupid and not follow the teachings that he's laid out very plainly. If I just did this, then I wouldn't be going through this right now. You know, so whenever I hear people talk about God that way, I just don't view him that way. And there's going to be Christians that disagree with me on that. And that's fine. I mean, it's not something I'm going to sit and argue with people about. If people have this view of God as an authoritarian, I disagree completely. And I'm not saying he's not going to do things to set things right, because this is his policy. This is his plan. But at the same time, he gives us this free will to live our life, even if we're making bad decisions along the way. You know, so I don't like that view of God. I see it so much in Christian circles too. I remember my grandmother telling me something a long time ago when I was a child, and it has stuck with me. It has stuck with me to this time. I'm almost 50 years old now, and it's always in my head, because a lot of our upbringing when we were younger, like my dad, he's still a Church of Christ preacher, but his views on grace and stuff has evolved immensely, dude. It is. I'm so amazed to listen to him talk now. So I don't think the Church of Christ is just as I don't think they're as harsh as they used to be. But growing up, like my grandmother, she hated that side of, like on my granddad's side, the Church of Christ side of it. And she told me, she goes, I don't believe that God's waiting around the corner to jump out and get me every day. And there was a lot of that view. There's a lot of that views with a lot of Christians, that God's just waiting around there to get you if you're doing something wrong. And she told me that as a child, and it's stuck with me to this day. Maybe that's why it's helped form my view of God. I don't know, but it's something that's stuck with me my entire life. And I appreciate that. Just that little short conversation I had with my grandmother when I was a child,
So good. Yeah. I know you've had Brian Zond on before. He has this like little syllogism, which is like, God looks like Jesus. God has always looked like Jesus. We haven't always known this, but now we do.
Right.
So, like, yeah, I probably messed that up, but it's something on that order, is like that Jesus completely reveals the heart of the Father. I mean, Hebrews chapter 1, he's the exact imprint of his nature. And Philip, when he asked Jesus, hey, show us the Father, and Jesus is like, have I been with you so long that you don't know? He's like, when you see me, you see the Father.
Right. And I get that from Christians too. And I'm like, but Jesus said when you've seen him, you've seen the Father. So what you're describing, some of the stuff going on in the Old Testament, it doesn't look like anything that Jesus would advocate for. And if we've seen God when we see Jesus, then something else is going on here. I can't explain it. Matt could probably explain it, could explain it a lot better than I can. And with it, maybe that's another time for another episode. But I just wanted to point out too, because there's a lot of that when I talk to secular anarchists and even Christian anarchists about how I view God. I don't view him as an authoritarian. I understand this is his world and he created it and we're all living in it. I get that. But I don't view God as somebody who's just overbearing. I just believe he's a partner. He's got some really cool ideas that I should probably follow if I want to live the best life that I can while on this earth.
Yeah, and we see even throughout the Old Testament, and this is echoed in the New Testament, is when you push against God's way, he hands you over to your desires. I mean, that's Romans 1. He's handing you over, like he hands people over and eventually leads to death. The way that God has set up the world isn't that he's waiting around the corner trying to zap you. It's that when you rebel against his way, it naturally leads to consequences that hurt.
Right, and you did it to yourself. And it's to me, it's the same way I view government too. Like we read 1 Samuel 8. We ain't even talked about 1 Samuel 8 today. We're going to talk about the Old Testament, But when God laid out what's going to happen when you choose a king other than him, he says what's going to happen, and it still happens today.
Yeah.
We did that. That's how I view government. We did this to ourselves, and if you think you're going to go in there and fix it with more government is asinine to me. The only course now is to get back to Jesus. Mm-hmm. If you want to fix things, let's follow Jesus. This whole no king but Christ needs to resonate with Christians very quickly, because if you want to fix the government, get back to Jesus. That doesn't mean go finding Christians and put them in office. That's stupid.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, like starting in Genesis 12, when he calls Abraham and says he's going to make him a great nation. I mean, God was the king of that nation. God is described as the king, like when he rescues them from Egypt. I mean, it even says in Exodus that the 10 plagues were judgments on the gods of Egypt. They're judgments on the ones who were Egypt's kings. But Yahweh, because he's calling them out so that they might worship and serve God in the wilderness. And then they become this nation. God gives them the land of Israel over there, but they reject God and they want a king. I mean, that's 1 Samuel 8. You talk about it all the time. The thing that I think is interesting there is the king they choose, the first king they choose was Saul, right? And what was Saul? He was the tallest, right? That's the reason they choose him, is because they want a king like the other nations. What were the other nations' kings? They were these Nephilim kings from Genesis 6, right? Why do they want a tall person to be king? So they could be like the other nations. They're basically saying, God, we don't want you. We want the forbidden knowledge from back in Genesis 6 and all that. And we want a Nephilim king. Basically, we want to be like Babylon and all the other nations. We don't want you. Like, we want a physical king who's tall.
Who's tall. That reminds me of a man years ago. I remember watching. It was back in my days when I was still participating in politics and voting and all that garbage. And it reminds me of it was when George Bush, that was the first time I ever voted, but there was a conversation on the news and they were talking about how people they want a president who is at least 6 foot tall. And it was weird how they were described. Like do you remember Ross Perot?
Yeah.
Okay. So I lived in Texas at the time and I wasn't even old enough to vote, but I loved Ross Perot. And now that I look back, they didn't want Ross Perot as president because he was short and he had a squeaky voice.
Yep.
He had a lot of good ideas, but he wasn't going to win because he wasn't tall and he had a squeaky voice.
So essentially, like the tall thing there is connected back to Genesis 6 and the giants in that. Like Nephilim in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible there, is giants. They translate it as giants. So they wanted a giant king to be like the other nations, the other ones that were. So rather than being under Yahweh as the king, they wanted to be like, they wanted a king, and they wanted to be like the ones that were under the control of the other spiritual beings. So they wanted an empire, essentially, when they're asking that. They wanted, rather than the kingdom of God, they wanted an empire. They wanted a warlord king, a giant king, a Nephilim king, a giant. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember, too, I was talking to a guy at work, and maybe I've mentioned this before on the show, and I know I've talked about this. He said that the Bible says that the government's going to be on his shoulders, talking about the government's going to be on the shoulders of Jesus. And I was like, but what about 1 Samuel 8? And the guy looked at me confused. I was like, did you ever read 1 Samuel 8? I said, when you're going to vote and you're going to put somebody in power, you're rejecting God. It says it right there in 1 Samuel 8. It's not, and he goes, well, and he couldn't really answer. He goes, well, I have to get back to you on it. He never got back to me on it. But that's why I take the stance that if a person goes to vote, a Christian goes to vote knowing what they know, if you're going to vote, you're rejecting God, and to me, that's a sin. I think that rejection of God is a sin. I don't know how else to explain what rejection of God is. And if 1 Samuel 8, when God told Samuel, he said, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And once that dawned on me, I'm like, well, if that's a rejection of God, well, then if that's not a sin, then what the hell is a sin? I don't know. If that's not a sin, I don't know what a sin is. So let's talk about 1 Samuel 8. Maybe we'll put a pin in it until the next episode, and maybe we'll start back up there because I don't want to keep you too long. I know you got kids up and stuff too, but let's talk about 1 Samuel 8 for a little bit. Unless we've skipped over something you want to put in there too, because I know you got some notes.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing about 1 Samuel 8 is the people were rejecting God as king, and God tells them, all right, here's all the stuff you're going to get. Here's all the stuff that the nations give you. You're going to be taxed. You're going to be all this stuff. He's like, do you still want it? And they're like, yes, we still want it. We want a king. And then in the next chapter after that is when they choose Saul, who is a whole head taller than anybody else in the nation. So like I said earlier, they wanted a giant because of they wanted a warlord king rather than have Yahweh who was fighting their battles for them. They wanted a human king to fight their battles for them. That's like the whole point of it. And God says, like you said, it's that this is a rejection of me.
And I think maybe you and I agree on this, but do you think it's a sin to go and vote? I mean, because it's something that I've talked about quite a bit. And since we're going to be releasing this series in an election year, I think maybe you don't take the stance I do on it, but it's just something that it's not something I go beat people over the head with either. It's just where I'm at with it because I don't know how else to look at it.
Yeah, I don't go beat people over the head with it either. But I mean, I think if we're electing someone to rule us that is not God, then I'm like, like you can go vote, just pencil in Jesus. I mean,
yeah. If you feel the need to participate, go vote for Jesus.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't think Jesus would show up on Inauguration Day either, though.
Probably wouldn't. I mean, maybe he'd come back and all creation would be his kingdom then.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to happen one day or another. But
yep, one day or another, he's coming back. No, a couple of the other texts I think that really like point to kind of the overlap of these spiritual beings and empire. We find in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, and they're two texts that people often go to show like maybe the fall of Satan. And so they're both really interesting texts. So Ezekiel 28 is about the prophet Ezekiel is critiquing the king of Tyre. And he gives this comparative story of basically this divine cherub who was in the garden and fell from his position. And it's very similar in Isaiah 14, which is the critique of the king of Babylon. And what I think that is really going on there, they use in both of these texts it's a Hebrew word called mashal, which is a comparative story, is really what that word means. So he's doing a comparative story and showing how the pride of the king of Tyre and the pride of the king of Babylon and the way that they're ruling is actually analogous of the fall of Satan from his status with God, from the divine council. You're saying that the way that they are in their empires are actually demonic and not, like, they're opposite of God's ideals. So he's putting that, basically he's saying that the animating power behind empire is actually Satan in both those texts. He's saying that you're being animated by Satan, and your pride and your fall and what's coming upon you is basically in parallel to Satan's fall because of his pride in basically the stories in the Old Testament.
And knowing that we know this, and not everybody knows this, and that's why I'm glad we're doing this. And I'm hoping that when people listen to this series, they share it with all of their friends that are still bent on going and participating in the kingdoms of this world. I mean, that's another thing too, that I don't understand Christians, how they can't see this, where Jesus said, I've got my own kingdom. When you participate in the kingdoms of this world, you're participating in the kingdoms of Satan, or the kingdoms and his demons, or the adversary to God. I mean, and it's so interesting to me that I'm glad that we started this way, and I'm glad that's how you started your dissertation, basically, is to lay all this out, because this is in the Old Testament too. You know, we focus a lot on the New Testament here on this podcast, mainly because that's what I'm more familiar with. I'm not a huge Old Testament guy. It doesn't mean I haven't ever read it, but I've done more study on the New Testament and how the early church carried on, the New Testament stuff. You know what I'm saying? So that's been really my focus. But I like this Old Testament stuff is very fascinating to me, and it's maybe something I should probably look more into, especially with, like I said in the very beginning, that they didn't have Romans 13. The early church didn't have Romans 13. So they're really relying on a lot of their text from the Old Testament and how they understood that view.
Yeah, the writers of the New Testament were continually echoing the Old Testament. When they just quote it, they would have expected that their audience knew the context of it. I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we discount or don't pay attention to the Old Testament. And yes, there's some further revelation that Jesus is basically, I say Jesus is our hermeneutic. He's the way that we have to go into the Old Testament with a sponsor, and Jesus is our sponsor. So we take him into the Old Testament, and he interprets it for us. We have to interpret it through the lens of Jesus, and through the lens of the cross and the resurrection and his ascension to the right hand of God. And that's the way we need to view the Old Testament text, because the whole purpose of that, it was all pointing to Jesus anyways. The New Testament even says that all the law, all the stuff in the Old Testament were just shadows, and Jesus is the substance of it.
And I think you're right. I think, and maybe I've done myself a disservice by not putting more emphasis on the Old Testament. It's just, I think when I read the Old Testament, maybe it's confusing for me to understand it, because I don't have all like the background like you do to understand what they're really talking about. But listening to you talk, and I was sitting here thinking about it from the very beginning until the end, it's just God working to bring his people back to him.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole purpose of Eden to Eden. And then you got Abraham, which was the whole purpose was to reclaim the nations. And what does Paul say in Galatians, I think it's chapter 3, is that, all these promises that were given to Abraham weren't given to Abraham's seeds, plural, but was given to Abraham's seed, singular, which is Christ.
Yeah.
So the whole purpose, the whole Abrahamic covenant, is Jesus, who is the king, who, he's the king. He is the one who established the kingdom, which is to draw people out from all of the other Elohim. The whole cross is depicted, what did Jesus say? The purpose of him coming was to defeat the works of the devil, to defeat these spiritual powers, to defeat these kingdoms and pull them into his kingdom.
Yeah.
And that's the whole purpose.
And it's spelled out through scripture. And I think that's why this is going to be such a fun series. Like I said, we've never done this on the podcast, do a series. And so I'm excited to do this, and I'm excited that you agreed to do more than one show on it too, because there's so much in this that is missed by so many Christians. I could talk about secular types all day long on the show, but that's not really what the Bad Roman was built around. I mean, the Bad Roman was built around trying to get Christians back to this no king but Christ understanding that the early church had. And it looks like even the folks in the Old Testament had the same understanding.
Yeah.
We're working back towards that, and God's reconciling everybody back to Him and doing it through the kingdoms of this world. Who it's obvious. I mean, it should be obvious, especially you don't have to read the Bible. Just look how they behave. Look how the kingdoms of this world behave. They steal, they kill,
Yeah.
they coerce. It's all contrary to the teachings of Christ. And if you understand just the basic teachings of Christ, you should say, oh, wait a second, I shouldn't participate in it. And there's somewhere the Bible says to flee from evil. The kingdoms of this world is evil.
Like in all that stuff, in Second Temple Judaism, they saw that like all those ideas of all the stuff you just listed, like even like war and weapons and things like that, was all forbidden demonic knowledge.
Really?
So, yeah, I mean, that was their commentary on Genesis 6 was part of that before of the whole sons of God, daughters of men thing, that these spiritual beings came down and introduced this stuff into the world, which resulted in empire building, which that's really what the Tower of Babel was, trying to build the first empire. They're building with bricks. I mean, building with bricks is man-made. It's analogous of something that's man-made in the Bible. So what were they doing? They were building with bricks, the Tower of Babel. What does God build with? He builds with stone.
Okay. Maybe this is an obvious question then. And then maybe I'm going to sound stupid when I ask this. If they already had the knowledge of God, but they came down and introduced all these weapons of, the demonic weapons of war and stuff like that and all that stuff, but they already had the knowledge of God, what turned them? Which is maybe, now that I think about it, is a stupid question, because we have the knowledge of God with Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And we still participate in this stuff.
Who knows? Maybe we've stopped listening to the voice of the Spirit in us.
Yeah, but what about those folks that fell and they came in and they introduced all this stuff? Where did they get this knowledge from if they already had the knowledge of God? I guess maybe it's a stupid question. I don't know, but it's just, maybe it's not something you can answer. I don't know, but it's just,
I honestly don't know. What we do know from the New Testament, we have in 2 Peter and in Jude, is that God, those angels that did do this in the days of Noah, it says, are locked up in what they call Tartaru or Tartarus. They're locked up like awaiting the day of judgment.
Okay.
So that's their view. The Second Temple Jewish view is that these fallen spiritual beings that corrupted humanity, God has them locked up and imprisoned until the day that He will judge the whole world.
And so if they're locked up, they're not really.
Well, it might just be those ones, not all of the ones that are like ruling the nations that aren't God's kingdom. It was those specific ones that introduced this in Genesis 6. That's the Jewish point of view of it, and it seems like the New Testament writers echo it in both the letter of Jude and the letter of 2 Peter.
Okay, because my question was going to be, if they're locked up, how are they still influencing the world? And then I was like, maybe
humans pass it on.
They influenced the world enough. Yeah, the humans just picked up on it, just kept doing it, and so I don't. So maybe that's what's going on.
And I mean, Genesis 6 was before the disinheriting of the nations at Babel.
Okay.
So it just keeps going on. But I mean, we're supposed to submit to our King, Christ, to put down our weapons, to live in His peaceable kingdom, and to influence, pull the world into His kingdom, into His church, and to live under Him as our true ruler.
No king but Christ.
No king but Christ.
Did we miss anything that you wanted to go over today? If not, let's put a pin in it, and we'll pick up with the next episode.
No, I mean, there's so much in the Old Testament. I think we're good. I just wanted to end by reading like 2 verses here in Deuteronomy 4, which I think if we read them through the lens of Christ, I think that they're awesome. Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, it says, "To beware lest you lift your eyes to the heavens and see the sun or the moon or the stars or all of the gods of heaven, and be drawn away and worship and serve them, those which the Lord has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you out of the iron furnace of Egypt," or you could say Babylon, or out of the possession of these other gods, "to be a people of His own possession today. So worship and serve Him."
I like it. It's a good idea. That's what I was saying earlier. He's got some really good ideas that we just need to listen to.
Yeah. He said, don't go after those gods. Don't be turned away to worship and serve them. I mean, no king but Christ.
All right. So the next episode, folks, we're going to go into 1 Peter 2, which is going to be fun for me because, like I said, we focus so much on Romans 13, but we very rarely talk about 1 Peter, and I don't know why that is, what the reason is, but I don't know. Maybe it's because Paul's writings were so prominent in the New Testament over Peter. I don't know.
Well, Romans 13 seems to be a stronger case for the ones who want government than 1 Peter is. 1 Peter's easier to pick apart, so they just go for the other one.
Okay. Before I let you go ahead and plug Expedition 44, anything else you're working on. And if folks want to reach out and read this dissertation, where they can find it, or you can just send it to them if they email you or something. Because I know we've had in the discussion group, when I talked about having you on to talk about this, people got really interested and they wanted to read this themselves, and which I encourage. I don't want y'all to just listen to this. I want y'all to go read the dissertation, because it's so detailed and there's so much information in there that people are missing when it comes to this topic. But go ahead and plug anything you want to plug, and then we'll pick up with the next episode.
Yeah, expedition44.com. We have a bunch of posted articles in that. You can find Expedition 44 on any of your favorite podcast apps. You can watch us on YouTube. Just type it in, you'll be able to find us. No King But Christ, our website there. We've got a bunch of links to articles and links to different episodes and that. If you want to reach out to me, you can email Matt at expedition44.com, and I'd be happy to share my dissertation with you. I don't know if Covenant Theological Seminary, which is the seminary I graduated from, and Ryan, my co-host, is the president of CTS. I don't know if they published it officially yet. They might have. I just don't know about it. So it might be out there. You might be able to Google it and find it. I believe the title was Principalities, Powers, and Allegiances. Basically reading I can't remember my subtitle even. Something about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. I think it was interpreting Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, and Revelation 13 through the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So you can Google it. It might be out there at maybe by the time this video is posted, if it isn't. But if not, just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to share it with you, Matt at expedition44.com. Thanks for having me on.
All right, man. I'm going to let you get out of here. Then we'll pick this up in the next episode of this series. Like I said, I really appreciate you agreeing to do that. This is going to be exciting. This is exciting for me. It's going to be really exciting for the listeners, I'm sure, too, because it's another election year. Let's talk about Romans 13 again. So, all right, buddy. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Bad Roman Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts to never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, it really helps people find us. 100% of donations are given to local charities in Memphis, Tennessee. To learn more about the Bad Roman Project and to find show notes, please visit thebadroman.com.